Hello, welcome back to Bonaventure Time. Today is going to be a little different than other days. I'm not going to talk about a philosopher or a major philosophical text. I've gotten some questions from some people on what to do if you're not really ready for, say, Husserl's ideas or Thomas Aquinas's being in essence, Stein's action and potency, the commentary on the sentences, being in time by Martin Heidegger. What do you do if you're not ready for that? What do you read? Where do you begin? Really, where do you begin to begin philosophy? So today I thought I would talk about that, give some tips for reading philosophy, for studying it academically, but also tips for just personal life and incorporating philosophy into the personal, normal Catholic life. And I'll start with just the personal, practical for every Catholic, but some of it will be, of course, applicable for studying it academically and actually necessary for studying it academically. The first thing I recommend, and I think I should first state that I think everyone should be a philosopher. And the reason why I believe that is because if we break down philosophy in its Greek roots, it's philos, which is love, and sophia, which is wisdom. So philosophy is the love of wisdom. And as Catholics, we understand that wisdom is Christ himself. So we are all called to fall in love with Christ. So in many ways, in a true way, everyone is called to be a philosopher, to be a lover of wisdom, to be a lover of Christ, right? And that doesn't mean, right, and philosophy I think becomes misconceived as perhaps you take from the moderns, or even sometimes in the late scholastic period, where it just seems confusing and it seems like a lot of big terms, and that's what philosophy is about, is creating these big words that really no one understands or no one's ever heard of, and trying to sound super intelligent. That could not be further from the truth. That is not what philosophy is about. That doesn't mean, right, sometimes what seems like a complicated but actually is an intelligible word is unimportant, but what it means is that's not the point. The point of philosophy is to be a lover of wisdom and a lover of Christ. So the beginning point for all philosophy, and I would say for everyone, for even just for the normal Catholic, is to pray. This is a way to grow in philosophy. This is actually, I think, the necessary starting point, even if you're going to study academically. To pray. Mental prayer, adoration, fall in love with Christ. You cannot study philosophy if you're a Catholic without falling in love with Christ. Even if you're not Catholic, right, you have to fall in love with wisdom to pursue philosophy. This is even noticeable by Socrates in the Republic, where he talks about the necessity of falling in love with wisdom. He actually goes as far as to say that to be unfaithful to wisdom is analogous to being unfaithful in a marriage. He really emphasized the importance of falling in love with wisdom and actually having a true relationship with wisdom. So even Socrates in the 300s to 400 BC, I should say, understood the importance of having a relationship with wisdom. And so for Catholics, every Catholic, that is so important. Have a relationship with Christ. Fall in love with him. Fall in love with wisdom. Right? And we even, here in the scriptures, we're called to love God with all our hearts and all our minds, right? So we're called to give him our intellects. So there's falling in love with Christ, but there's also giving him our intellects, which it doesn't necessarily mean, right, you have to be a scholar in philosophy. But I think it also does mean that the Lord is calling us to train our intellects and to use them prudently, wisely, right? We're called to participate in the offices of Christ, priest, prophet, and king, right? Part of that is governing. Part of that is prudence. Part of that is, right, knowing how to use your intellect, right? And so the Lord really does desire us to give us, all of ourselves, and that includes the intellect. So training it is also an important thing, even for just the normal Catholic. So prayer. And that was something recommended by Aquinas, right? His students would ask him, like, where do we start to study? How do we study better? And he would say, pray. That was the first thing he would tell them. Pray. And it's so true. And I found this to be true. Many other better philosophers than me have found this to be true, or at least the Catholic ones. And I stand by it. It's just, you have to pray. You have to fall in love with wisdom. You have to fall in love with Christ to study philosophy, to be a philosopher, right? To be that lover of wisdom. And this doesn't necessarily mean, even if you want to study on the academic level, that you have to bring hard philosophical questions to our Lord. You know, he is wisdom himself, so that is a good idea. But that's not even just the point. Sometimes it's just being there, and that is being a true philosopher. Because again, it's not about being complex. That's not what philosophy is about. Philosophy is about a relationship with wisdom. It's about falling in love with wisdom, pursuing the truth, right? Moving just past mere knowledge and memorizing these, fun philosophical facts and actually falling in love with wisdom. And moving just past knowledge, pursuing truth, right? So that is so important. And so sometimes the greatest philosophical, you could say, adoration you could have is just being there, contemplating and falling in love with our Lord. So that's my first recommendation. And I think that's applicable for everyone, even if you're just a normal Catholic who doesn't necessarily want to read philosophical texts or study academically. So I'll go more into now reading philosophy. We'll start with that. And then we'll go into studying it academically. Where to begin? And I'll give some book recommendations that I think are helpful. But I think to begin, if you want to start reading philosophy, it kind of depends on who you are, right? And this is not a cop-out answer, although it might sound like one. The reason I say that is because people think differently, right? Not everyone just thinks the same way. Some people are very analytic, right? They have a sort of mathematical mind, mathematical reasoning. And if that's the case, you're probably going to love systematics, and you're probably going to love Aristotle. And I would start with Aristotle if that's the case. If you're more like, say, if you want to use like the Myers-Briggs as a reference, if you're more like if you're more of a feeler, you're probably, you come to things, say, through the senses, which sounds Aristotelian if you're familiar with philosophy, but if you like the senses and if you're very intuitive, I would recommend the Platonic dialogues is a great starting point. So actually, I take that back. Not if you're if you're familiar with the Myers-Briggs, and if you're not, maybe this is a bad example. But if you say you're very intuitive, I would say you're intuitive and you do really, you're very spontaneous, say, and like, sorry, I'm thinking of a sports reference to make this more clear. I would always think of this example, and I'll give this example. My brother and I, we love golf, and when we putt so differently. My brother is very analytical. He studies the putt, and he does his practice strokes, and then he hits the putt according to how he reasoned. The putt and the green and the slope and all that. For me, I just get up there and feel it with my feet, which sounds really crazy to some people, but it's actually a real thing in golf. And it's funny. It's a difference in golf that people do, different ways they play it. But that can be made analogous to this. If you're very intuitive in that kind of sense and do things based off of feeling, not solely off of feeling, hopefully, I would start with the Platonic dialogues. And I would say the Meno and the Socrates defense is a really great place to start. Even if you are more analytic and more of a analytic thinker, I would actually say the Credo and the Meno and Socrates' defense are really great places to start with philosophy. Understanding definition, because that's a big thing in philosophy, is we get to the heart of things. We don't give possibilities, like, say, psychology, right? Or really a lot of what's called the natural sciences these days. We give absolutes. So we have to come to the essences of things and the true nature, right? So definition is a big thing. In the Credo, the Meno, and Socrates' defense is a great example of really philosophy in its beginnings. But nonetheless, if you are more of an analytical thinker, I would start with the categories of Aristotle, the topics, and maybe De Anima if you're feeling a little ambitious. Topics, categories, and De Anima. And say you come into philosophy and you want to read it, maybe not just for academic reasons, but you're more into ethics. I would read The Republic, again, if you're more intuitive and more of a feeler. But if you're more sense-oriented and an analytic thinker, I would read Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. I think that's a great place to start. If you're into aesthetics, Plato's Symposium is a great start. Aristotle's Poetics for the analytic thinkers, although I just recommend both. They're very great and they're pretty easy to understand. So those are both great starts if you're into aesthetics. Say you're more interested in logic, I would go into the Organon of Aristotle. So that would be like the topics, categories, posterior and prior analytics. And if you're into epistemology, the Republic books 6 and 7 specifically. If you don't want to read all of it, it's a pretty long dialogue. That's the cave and the divided line analogy, and then I would read from Aristotle more of that logical, but I'd also read De Anima specifically, book 3. If you just want a short bit of it. Those are good if you're interested in how do we come to know things, how can we know things with certitude, what is the act of reasoning. Those are great ways, I think, to start with those different subjects. Metaphysics. So this is probably not what you want to hear, but metaphysics actually, I think, is the beginning of philosophy and is important to understand epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, all the different philosophical disciplines. But it's also probably the hardest, or at least in my opinion it was, and I found with my fellow philosophers that it's usually the hardest to understand. But what metaphysics studies really is being as being, or just reality in general, and it's really it's a dense discipline in philosophy, but I would recommend reading The One and the Many. I will warn if you're interested in reading this, it is still an advanced book, but I think it's the best cover of Aristotle's metaphysics, taking into account Plato, taking into account Aquinas, Bonaventure, and even Duns Scotus. So I would recommend The One and the Many, and I'd recommend The One and Many. I think this is a great place to start with metaphysics. And if you're able to get that down, it might take a read or two. You might have to reread some things, which in philosophy is, I think, necessary, actually. I think if you're able to get through it, philosophy is really going to open up for you if you're interested in reading other authors. So that's kind of where to begin if you want to get into philosophy. But maybe you're not even interested in reading the philosophers in general. Who are some good authors to go to kind of introduce philosophy without actually reading these actual philosophical texts? Well, and I'm biased here because I'm just a big fan of him, but I would read The Art of Living by Dietrich von Hildebrand. And Alice von Hildebrand. Honestly, that is a great introduction it's very practical, so even the normal Catholic, you'd be very interested in this, I believe. Those who want to study it academically, those who want to just read philosophy, I think this is a book for everyone. It's very practical, it gives you an introduction to philosophy, and it's very academic in itself, but very well laid out, very simple, which is good in philosophy. And I think a great read. So Art of Living by Dietrich von Hildebrand, I think, is a great place to start if you just want to read without reading, right, these major philosophical texts. And I'd also say Peter Kreeft is usually good at giving introductions to philosophy. I was gonna recommend somebody. Actually, he's pretty he's pretty dense. I would say another great book to start with. It's not really known as a philosophical text. It's in my opinion, a fantastic philosophical text, but it's also very practical and applicable and very easy to read. It's actually how I got into philosophy, was Augustine's Confessions. That is a very well written book, but it's also very accessible and it's not difficult. And it's full of a lot. And again, I think that's another book like The Art of Living, where it just really it satisfies all readers, whether you're a hardcore philosopher or just someone who's just trying to live live the Catholic life and is not trying to be an academic scholar. So I'd recommend Augustine's Confessions as well. I don't recommend, unless you really want to, reading, say, the commentary on the sentences, the Summa Theologiae, unless you're really actually interested in that. There's not really a need for just, to read that. I love them. I certainly think they're beautiful, but I don't see a need necessarily to read those. So just kind of moving along here, we've prayers, the beginning, right? That's practical, art of living, confessions, Peter Kreeft. If you're interested in just practical, and not really, becoming interested in philosophy, but still, having some sort of interest in philosophy. And then if you want to start reading, right, those different Platonic dialogues and Aristotelian books. The reason I recommend those is if you understand, and this is more for if you want to study philosophy academically. So if you're not this, you can stop watching because I'll probably just talk about this now from now on. The reason I recommend the Aristotelian and the Platonic dialogues is because if you can understand them, it really helps understanding Aquinas, because he takes a lot from Aristotle, even Bonaventure, because he takes a lot from Aristotle, also Plotinus, and so Plotinus is a good one to learn, but Plato, if you want to learn Augustinian thought, he's not all Platonic, but he certainly takes a lot from Plato. So, and it just opens up because you can see how it contrasts with the moderns. If you're interested in modern and contemporary thought, well, actually, if you're interested in modern thought and reading them, in order to not be, say, entrapped into the, because the moderns write they have a lot to offer, but they're also very dangerous. And what makes them dangerous is their thinking is actually very attractive. And there's moments where you're like, wow, that makes sense. Maybe there is no reality, right? Which is not true. I would say, read the pre-Socratics. Read Heraclitus, Anaxagoras. Especially read Democritus and Leucippus and understand them. And Epicurus. If you read them, those pre-Socratics, you're going to understand Stuart Mill, utilitarianism. You're going to understand determinism and rationalism with Descartes and Leibniz and Rousseau, and even leading that up to Jean-Paul Sartre and Beauvoir and Heidegger. And you will understand why modern philosophy came about, why they write the things that they do. It's not as arbitrary as it might seem. And you will also understand the dangers in it and why they're wrong in many ways. Why Aristotle and Plato came about. Because a lot of times you look at it, it can be looked at as modern philosophy came out of nowhere and just blew everything up. No, there was the pre-Socratics, there was the response by Plato and Aristotle, and then there was the response and the addition and building off of the Platonic and Aristotelian thought, and post-Aristotelian and Plotinus, Plutarch, and Philo and all these people. And then you have the Scholastics, perhaps one of the highest points in philosophy. Then you have the moderns, and really the moderns are responding back to Plato and Aristotle, who responded to the pre-Socratics. And they're building back off the pre-Socratics. So it makes a lot more sense, and you can actually understand their thought better and take some things from them, but also recognize why they're wrong in many ways and why they're dangerous. So pre-Socratics, if you want to study modern thought, I recommend them. And if you want to study contemporary thought, understanding the big difference between contemporary thought and ancient Greek and scholastic thought, especially in the Catholic life. What makes them different? And again, this is more for people who are interested in studying academically. The big differences, and Karol Wojtyła or St. John Paul II notes this, up till the scholastic period and the late Renaissance, although you saw the beginnings of a turn in the late Renaissance, there was a study of being and the object. In modern and contemporary as well, there's a study of consciousness and the subject. So there's a huge shift where you have the object in reality, then you have the conscious subject. And so understanding even the difference in good contemporary Catholic philosophers, you have to understand that shift that's made in studying the subject. And this has to be, again, and I've talked about this in other videos, so I won't go too much into it, but it has to be, right, it has to still complement objective reality. But there's also a benefit to studying the subject, and those good contemporary philosophers understand that. And so you can see really good philosophy, actually, and many advancements that they make right? And I'm thinking, namely, Stein's empathy, Hildebrand, and his value philosophy, even Edmund Husserl in the beginnings of phenomenology in the logical investigations, part one, right? And there's many more, right? There's great things on Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Adolf Reinach. Even there are some things you can take from Max Scheler. Most especially you can take from Gilles Sohn, Jacques Maritain, right? There's many great things you can take, but that's a fundamental difference, is they do focus on the subject, maybe with the exception of Maritain, and there's more, but him specifically. There's a turn towards the subject. So that's a difference, and you have to be aware of that is helpful, because you understand they're not trying to redefine reality. They're trying to define the subject in reality, if they're a good one. And they're not existentialist. So that's helpful if you want to understand contemporary thought, I believe. Books, if you really want to get into the advanced texts, understanding where it came from. A philosophy, like I said with the moderns, is not just arbitrary. It comes from somewhere. And so understanding where something came from, or who influenced, right, who was the mentor to this person, can be very helpful in understanding different philosophies that might seem very hard. Right, Martin Heidegger, one of the hardest, famously one of the hardest philosophers to read. Understanding him becomes a lot easier when you understand what group is he a part of. Okay, he's an existentialist phenomenologist. So that requires two things. Maybe understanding Husserl, which is almost impossible sometimes. So maybe not understanding Husserl. If you want to understand phenomenology, I would read Introduction to Phenomenology by Sokolowski. That's a great introduction. Understanding phenomenology. Okay, I get what he's saying here with consciousness, subject, and object, correlation, all these principles, right? Also understanding Kierkegaard, who was attributed to be the father of existentialism, but he never called himself an existentialist. Understanding him, and he's much easier to read than Heidegger, is very helpful for understanding Heidegger, especially like being in time. And I talked about this in an existentialist video I made, right? The concept of anxiety in Heidegger, or sometimes what he calls uncanny, or what Camus, is it Albert? Camus, I think it's Camus Albert. He talks about the absurd. Things like that are so much easier if you read Kierkegaard. So that's an example. Aristotle, actually, in my opinion, is harder to understand than Thomas Aquinas. So I actually, that one, it is important. It actually, yeah. So I actually started with Aquinas before reading really in-depth Aristotle. I kind of regret that, but I kind of don't, because he was easier to understand in my mind. But a greater understanding of Aristotle actually has helped me understand Thomas Aquinas much more, and understand Aquinas' thought, what he takes from Aristotle, what he expands from Aristotle, and what he rejects from Aristotle. So things like that, or even talking about Plato, understanding Augustinianism. It's not purely Platonism, but it certainly is influenced by it. If you understand Augustine, then you can understand Bonaventure better. Again, he's not purely Augustinianism. He actually, which is very unknown actually. He's actually very Aristotelian, even though he rejects Aristotle. He still takes a lot from him. So it's actually important to know Augustine and Aristotle, Plotinus, Plato, if you want to understand Bonaventure better. So those are just a few examples. So understanding who influenced a philosopher can be very helpful for reading it. So if you're struggling with a text, maybe read who influenced that philosopher, and that might help open up understanding that philosophy you want to study. Also, there's another thing. You're never going to know everything. And I'll probably end with this, because this is probably a good place to end. You're never going to know everything, right? And remembering scripture is very important, I think, for the philosopher, especially the Catholic philosopher. But particularly, the wisdom of God is the folly of man. And I think if we sit with that and pray with that, we'd realize, yeah, it's so true. I don't even think you really need to sit down and pray with that to understand that that's true, but praying with it certainly reveals a lot more. We're not going to know everything as philosophers. And it's hard, because philosophers with that passionate pursuit of truth desires to know, not just hopefully for knowledge's sake, like a sophistic, way, and I'm speaking about the sophists, but it's just in a desire to pursue truth. But we have to be content with knowing we are not going to know everything, right? And we're not meant to, right? We're meant to pursue truth in the eyes of the plan that God has given has made for us, and so we have to be content with that. And so, and maybe you just want to read philosophy and get more into it and not necessarily study academically. It's okay if you have a favorite and you just kind of know more about this favorite, right? It's okay if you just like Aquinas and you just want to read Aquinas. You don't have to study Aristotle. You don't have to read Plato, like my recommendations I just gave. That's not necessarily necessary. You're just looking to read it. Or if you love Bonaventure, right? It's okay to admit Aquinas has a better metaphysics in some ways, although I'd argue Bonaventure's metaphysics is actually misunderstood and there's a lot you can take from it. It's okay to still admit that Aquinas probably has a better metaphysics than Bonaventure and still just read Bonaventure, right? These guys like St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas are canonized for a reason. And certainly it wasn't just that they were brilliant, they were holy men, but, right, there was certainly a brilliance to them. So that's okay if you just have a favorite and you just want to stick to that favorite, right? There's nothing that is being imposed on you. And I think that's the danger in philosophy. We feel like we have to know. We don't. Wisdom is a gift. Solomon talked about that in Wisdom. It's a gift, and it's given to us from God, right? And wisdom is Christ himself, right? So it's a gift. We don't have to know everything, right? We only do it out of a faithful pursuit of the truth, out of a faithful love for wisdom and love for Christ. So it's okay if you don't read everything. Now, if you're going to be an academic scholar, in many ways, yeah, you kind of in some way have to, but still, like, you don't have to, you don't let perfectionism destroy philosophy, which I think sometimes you can see in some of the moderns. So you don't have to know everything, but still give God your best. So I'll end this video on that. And so I hope these tips are helpful, and I hope some of the book recommendations are helpful if you want to just get into philosophy, academically, personally, or right, whatever. I hope this is helpful, and please comment if you have any more questions on philosophy. And please subscribe if you haven't. Please share this if you would like. And I hope to see you next time. God bless.